4 years of recession caused by failed economic policies and a decline in global oil prices have plunged Venezuela into political chaos. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Last month, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro shocked many in his country by calling for a constitutional assembly to draft a new constitution. Maduro's opponents call the proposal a rigged proceeding meant to avoid a popular election. The embattled president has seen his political capital sapped by triple-digit inflation, plunging oil prices, and chronic shortages of food and consumer goods. Public anger has fueled almost daily protests since early April, with more than 70 people killed and no end in sight. There's much to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Jennifer McCoy is the founding director of Georgia State University's Global Studies Institute and the former director of the Americas program at the Carter Center. She joins us from Atlanta. With us from San Francisco is the coordinator for the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee, Gloria La Riva. Luis Angosto-Ferrandez is the author of Venezuela Reframed. He joins us from Australia, where he teaches Latin American Studies at the University of Sydney. And with us here in Washington is the Vice President of the Americas Society and Council of the Americas, Eric Farnsworth. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Jennifer, let me start with you. You know, as we've been reporting there, almost daily there have been protests in Venezuela since the beginning of April. 70 people have been killed in these protests, and there are these increasing shortages of food and of medicines. There's also a soaring murder rate in the country. What's it going to take to stop this?
Well, it's going to take incentives and disincentives to change the stalemate that currently exists between the government that really maintains all the levers of power. The only thing the opposition currently controls is the legislature, but that's pretty much emasculated by the Supreme Court. But the opposition has the people in the streets, and they're following this street strategy because they believe they have the vast majority of the population who have lost faith in this government and who no longer support it. But it's at a stalemate, almost like two cars driving at each other toward a head-on collision at this point and dragging the entire country down with them as the economy implodes and the humanitarian crisis continues. So it's going to take something to shift each side from their current position and to begin negotiations. And I think that will require a series of incentives, particularly toward the government, that they will receive some reassurances, some guarantees from the opposition and from the international community in the event that they were to agree to elections or a mechanism to leave power. Because right now what they fear is both a witch hunt against any of their supporters and a punitive action against those who are accused of criminal activity, which are some high-ranking officials.
Eric, President Maduro's response to this is a new constitution. We've seen this before. Hugo Chavez had a new constitution in 1999. Yeah. Is that the solution?
I don't think it's the solution at all. The solution is that they have to change course dramatically, restore the levers of economic growth and all the things that the Chavista movement has dismantled over the last 17 years. But it's clearly an effort that's designed to change the narrative, to show that the government is in control, to show that the government is trying to change the political discourse, and to really undermine, if you will, the people who have been in the streets protesting against the direction of the government since late March. This is something that I think is clearly political in nature. Some people in Venezuela itself say that it's unconstitutional. In other words, the Constitutional Assembly is itself unconstitutional because it hasn't been called by a popular referendum. And it also would seek to replace the Constitution, as you correctly say, Anand, that Hugo Chavez himself put into power. So from a political perspective, you're saying you're trying to show that Maduro would supersede the founder of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela itself. That's some tricky ground for the government to try to walk on, but I think it does show how desperate they're becoming and how they're looking to try to solidify their rule by all means possible.
Gloria, what is your view on this? Has the government lost control? Is the government now desperate?
The government of Nicolas Maduro is not only dealing with an opposition inside the country, it's having to contend with major funding by the United States and enormous interference by the Organization of American States, which is really directed by the United States, in which the head of the OAS, Luis Almagro, is illegally interfering, dictating to the country about when they should have their elections. That's not his role, and he has been defeated several times in trying to sanction Venezuela. Venezuela decided they're going to leave the OAS for good reason, I believe. But on the issue of the Constitution and the Constituent Assembly, Venezuela has had some 24 constitutions in its past. And the one that was ratified in 1999 was the very first one in Venezuela's history in which the people voted by more than 70% approval. And so with so many constitutions, the first one being popular in 1999 under Hugo Chavez, it is not unusual to think that there would be a new Constituent Assembly after some 18 years of testing of ways to perfect it. And in fact, there was great support for it. It's an attempt, I think, also to come out of this stalemate in which the government is being blamed for an economic crisis that it really is not responsible for. A huge plunge in oil prices worldwide has affected Venezuela, which depends on more than 90% of its income on oil.
Luis, are we being unfair when we blame the Venezuelan government under Nicolas Maduro for this economic crisis that the country finds itself in? Should we just, as Gloria pointed out, blame this on the falling oil price?
Well, certainly, partly this is dependent on oil prices. It is my opinion that still the government, of course, needs to take responsibilities for part of certainly what they can control in terms of economic policy within the country. And probably what the Chavista governments were incapable of materializing over the past 17 years has to do with a course that really accompanies Venezuela for basically a century now. And it's the fact that the oil industry keeps on basically sustaining the economy of the country. Chavista governments were incapable of transforming the economic structure of the country, but of course that doesn't make them basically subjectable to international condemnation or international sanctions. All governments may have more or less, let's say, accuracy and maybe positive effects in their economic policy, but that shouldn't, in my view, lead anyone to consider that the government is illegitimate for maybe mistakes in their economic policy.
Jennifer, you talked a moment ago about offering the government some kind of incentives for change to take place. There is one incentive that has already been offered. There's been something like 40 human rights groups which are talking about they talk about transitional, I think it's transitional justice, that's what it's called. They want the government to step down, essentially a kind of escape hatch for the government. So this would be some kind of amnesty, I guess. What are the chances of that happening? What are the chances of that being accepted by the government?
Well, I think something like that is going to be absolutely necessary. Transitional justice is something that countries use to move from a civil war to peace or from an authoritarian government to democracy. It's been used in this way. What it means is it's not impunity, which many Venezuelans fear, including some of those in the opposition, fear that it just means an amnesty, letting people get away with murder, literally, or other kinds of crimes. But it is not just impunity. It might be reduced sentences. It might be conditional sentences based on reparations to victims, financial reparations or other kinds of reparations, promises of not repeating the activity, whether it's a human rights crime or corruption or other illicit activity. So we can look for, as an example, to Colombia in their recent peace agreement with the FARC guerrillas, where there was this type of transitional justice. So what it does is allow a country to move forward through some kind of transition and to arrive to peace or an end to a conflict. The incentives are going to be, something needs to be offered. It doesn't mean an amnesty to everybody, but some kind of conditional sentencing or some kind of offering from government people who might already be indicted or alleged to have committed crimes, for example. And other than that, there needs to be reassurances to everyone who has been supporting the government that there won't be a witch hunt, because there actually was a type of witch hunt after the attempted coup in 2002 against President Chavez's government.
Okay, Gloria, go ahead.
I would really reject the idea that the government has to accept any transition. It's not just government officials, it's the majority of people who are benefiting from the Bolivarian project, and the idea that there would be some guarantees is ridiculous. President Maduro is a legitimate president, and they even accepted the loss in the National Assembly, which has turned out to be a disaster for the people, with the National Assembly majority right wing trying to take away some of the rights that people have gained in the last 18 years. And the violence that has been perpetrated by many of these gangs, the fascist gangs, and other criminality, there's no talk in the United States about them having to be judged for justice. As a matter of fact, the U.S. under Obama and now under Trump is increasing sanctions on individuals who are responsible for justice. The National Guard and other state officials have been sanctioned for trying to prosecute people who've been engaging in violence ever since, not just a year ago, but ever since February 2014, when President Maduro announced that those who were making 5,000% markup in profits on imports that people need were going to be possibly expropriated. It's the government's measures to try to arrest the profit gouging by the upper class that brought on the violence that's financed by the United States.
Well, actually, if we look at the Colombian model, we actually see that their transitional justice agreement can apply to anybody in Colombia who may have committed, in that case, human rights crimes.
Right.
And so a model can be perpetrated for others who may have also been involved, either in violence or in high-stakes corruption.
Well, I think it's a bit whimsical, to be honest, to compare the case of Colombia with the case of Venezuela. The conditions of these countries are absolutely different. The level of violence that Colombia has gone through for many decades is incomparable with what has happened in Venezuela. And there were actually mobilized military forces within the country, which is something that against the government, and not recognizing the legitimacy of the government in Colombia, and that doesn't happen in Venezuela. I think it's a bit whimsical, a comparison, and I think the model of transitional justice doesn't operate in this case and apply to Venezuela. People who do care about the well-being of Venezuelans should support as much as possible a return to institutional politics in the country, and that goes through, among other things, a call to both the opposition and government to recognize each other. It's been very disappointing that as of yesterday, the last declaration of the so-called Unity Round Table, the platform of the opposition, has made a call to basically misrecognize all public powers, the executive, the National Electoral Council, and the Supreme Court. That avenue certainly doesn't help really to appease tensions in the country, and doesn't help really to facilitate dialogue, political dialogue in the country.
Eric, this idea of transitional justice, is it a viable option? I guess the question is, why would Nicolas Maduro want to voluntarily give up power?
I mean, that's exactly the question. He doesn't, and he's not going to voluntarily. So to the extent that we're trying to find ways to ease him into the sunset, I mean, that's all very nice, except for one fatal flaw, and that is that he has no intention of going anywhere. That's the whole point of the Constitutional Assembly, to try to allow him a process to be able to remain in power, or certainly the Chavista movement ad infinitum. But I want to come back to this idea that has gotten some currency about the fact that the fall in oil prices is somehow responsible for Venezuela's economic collapse, and I fundamentally reject that. I mean, yeah, the price of oil today is lower than it was a couple of years ago, but the price of oil today is 3 times higher than it was when Hugo Chavez first came to power, and yet poverty in Venezuela is actually higher than it was when Hugo Chavez came to power. Number one. Number two, what happened to all those trillions of dollars that Venezuela gained from the sale of oil when oil was at $120 a barrel, which it's not now? The proceeds disappeared. They were squandered, they were taken, they find themselves in private accounts or given away for political purposes, whatever. So that's number two. Number three, Anand, is it's not just the fall in the price of oil, it's also the fall in the production of oil. Venezuela has collapsed its own energy sector by mismanagement, by lack of capital, and frankly by a massive brain drain of people who actually are required to run the energy sector, who are now in Colombia or Canada or Houston or other places and escaping Venezuela. And so if you don't have the human capital, the production of oil has actually decreased to now lower than 2 million barrels a day. So the price is down, the production is down. You can't blame that on the international community. And finally, yes, Venezuela is a petroleum exporting country, that's true, but the government has also destroyed every other avenue of economic gain in the country, all the rest of the private sector, all the other sectors that were productive previously, to rely now almost 100% and exclusively on the petroleum sector. So that, again, is the fault of, and the responsibility of the government. So to say that this is out of their hands and therefore not their responsibility is just a fallacy.
Okay, I want to get Gloria's response to that, but Gloria, first we're going to have to take a break. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.